Let's talk about the Steam Deck 2. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to Deck Ready. For today's video, I thought it'd be fun to go through a list of things and improvements I'd like to see in the eventual Steam Deck 2, because we all know it's going to happen eventually. Now, I've made a couple of lists like this before here on the channel, but in the past month and a half, I've been messing around with the ROG Ally, and while yeah, I do have a love-hate relationship with that device, it does genuinely do a few things better than the Steam Deck, and I think Valve could implement some of those things in a Steam Deck 2 without massively increasing the price or draining the battery life. So I thought it'd be fun to re-go over the list and talk about some refinements I think are worth making. Now, I think the component on the Steam Deck that has the most room for improvement is definitely the screen. There's nothing inherently wrong with the 16:10 800p panel that is included, but there are quite a few different spots where Valve needs to take a look at it. The first thing I think they can improve is color quality, and I think the best way to do that would be to include an OLED screen. Now, I've heard that it is kind of difficult to get a 16:10 OLED screen right now, and that's a big reason why they went with the panel they're using. But the current panel has some issues when you're talking about color accuracy or brightness or backlight bleed. It does look kind of washed out if you compare it to other screens like the ROG Allies or a current smartphone, and even if you're using stuff like Vibrant Deck or you have SteamOS 3.5's beta installed, so you have that saturation slider, it's still at the point where I don't think it's good enough even for how relatively cheap the Steam Deck is. Like, I've been playing Pokemon Legends Arceus over the past month or so, and even though that game doesn't look very good, like graphically speaking, I don't know what resolution it's running at, but it doesn't look like 720p. The textures are muddy, the draw distance is terrible, but having an OLED screen paired up with cell shaded graphics is a match made in heaven, and it makes that game totally worth playing. So if Nintendo can figure it out, I definitely think Valve could as well, and I don't think it would increase the cost of a Steam Deck 2 by that much, because like we've seen with the 2230 drives, as time has gone on, OLED has gotten more and more inexpensive. Now, the biggest point of comparison between the Steam Deck and the Ally, at least on the surface, is screen resolution. The Ally's is 1080p, the Steam Deck's is 800p, but I will point out, over the past month and a half of using the Ally, I have been mostly using it at 720p. When I'm on the desktop or I'm watching videos, I use that handy little toggle in the quick access menu to change it to 1080p, but when I'm done doing stuff like that and I get into a game like Diablo 4, I switch it to 720p, because at 1080p, you're limited to like 30 FPS at medium settings with FSR on quality, and at that point, I'd rather just play on the Steam Deck's native 800p screen at 40 FPS with the same settings. So for as good as the 1080p panel in the ROG Ally looks, I would definitely take an 800p panel that they just made bigger, right? Like, the bezels on the Steam Deck, if you compare them to the ROG Ally, look a lot better because of that 16:10 ratio, and also I think overall they are just a little bit smaller, but if they could increase the screen size and make those bezels smaller, a 16:10 800p screen would really fill out a Steam Deck 2. Whereas with the ROG Ally, the 16:9 screen, even if you make it bigger, it's just going to get wider instead of taller. So you're going to run into a bottleneck in terms of how small you're actually going to be able to make the bezels. It's still going to happen a little bit with a 16:10 screen, but the closer you get to a square screen, the less you're going to have to move out as you move up. And that's why I think the Steam Deck should keep that 16:10 ratio and just improve to an OLED screen that stays at 800p instead of bumping up to 1080p. It'd be good for battery life, and I think it would be great for performance. The next thing I'd like to see Valve work on for the Steam Deck 2 is more colorways at launch. Now, we have seen an explosion from brands like JSOX of swappable shells for the Steam Deck. You can get atomic purple, you can get orange, you can get green, you can get black, you can get smoky white, you can get tons of different colors. And while at first they were just back shells for the Steam Deck, which looked kind of weird as a sort of two-tone look for the thing, and I didn't really want to swap it out, eventually as time went on, we've seen full conversion mods for the Steam Deck, and while yes, they are pretty tricky, it's totally doable if you like tinkering around with your devices. And as someone who checks the Steam Deck subreddit every morning when I get up, I have seen so many people swapping out the shells on their Steam Deck to the point where there's obviously a demand here. So I think it'd be cool for Valve to cut the middleman out and offer some of these different colors that are extremely popular with people like atomic purple. And a huge reason for that is, unlike the ROG Ally, which is just a straight up Windows 11 PC with a handheld controller attached to it, the Steam Deck kind of bridges that gap between console and PC. And I mentioned this before here on the channel, but any barrier to entry Valve can remove makes it more of an enticing purchase for someone who's gaming on a Nintendo Switch or a modded Game Boy or something like that. And what I mean by that is, like, imagine if you're someone who only plays on the Nintendo Switch. You like the handheld nature of it, but you want a little bit more power, so you talk to your friends and you hear about the Steam Deck. So the first thing you do is head over to YouTube or the subreddit, and you see all these cool pictures of different colored Steam Decks like purple and orange. And because it's transparent, you're like, oh, that reminds me of the Game Boy Color I had back in the day. I'm sold. It's so cool. Valve Valve offers this. So you go over to Steam, you go to purchase a Steam Deck, and you only see one color option, and you're like, oh, how did they get these shells onto the Steam Deck? Oh, I have to take the thing apart, take every component out of it and put it back together? No thanks, I'm out. So if Valve is able to offer more colors out of the gate, it would definitely entice more people to buy a Steam Deck. And I would personally upgrade to an atomic purple one if they offered an official one. I'm not even talking about a Steam Deck 2, because if they make a Steam Deck 2, I'm buying a Steam Deck 2. If they made an atomic purple Steam Deck 1, I would definitely pick that up. But you know, the Steam Deck would also just look really good in white if they want to keep it simple. The next thing I think Valve absolutely has to do with the Steam Deck 2 is get rid of the 64GB option. It's definitely awesome that the Steam Deck comes with a built-in micro SD card slot, even though it'll snap your SD cards in half if you take off the back of your Steam Deck with an SD card in it. Do not make that mistake. I've seen it happen 1,000 times. But over the past year and a half or so of using the Steam Deck, I've definitely started to see that micro SD card slot as a crutch for 100% the 64GB model and arguably the 256GB model as well. Even though the prices have fallen quite a bit on 1TB micro SD cards over the past year, like I just got one on Prime Day for $65, which is kind of crazy. There are still a lot of drawbacks to saving all of your games to the micro SD card, like slower download speeds. It has to reserve space for a lot of games like Forza Horizon 5, for example. I've also heard you get reduced performance in AAA games on a micro SD card, but I'm just gonna straight up call it on that because I've played the new Dead Space off an SD card. It worked totally fine. I was playing Hogwarts Legacy for a little bit. It worked fine as well. The biggest reason I think that 64GB model needs to be eliminated though is because when you take SteamOS 3.0 into account, there's barely enough space there to install even one game. It's small enough to the point where like you have to buy a micro SD card with the Steam Deck. So at that point, if you're going for a terabyte version, even with the prices falling over the past year, I still think you're just basically forced into getting that 256GB model because it's only $100 more for a lot more storage and it's faster storage, right? Like the drive in the 64GB Steam Deck is slower storage than the SSD in the 256 and 512. So unless you're gonna buy an SSD on Amazon for $100, like a 1TB one, and install it yourself, there's really no reason to buy that 64GB Steam Deck. And the point I made about the shell swaps definitely applies here as well. Like some people just don't want to take the thing apart, and I don't blame them because it's expensive, right? Like everything is expensive right now, but while it is relatively cheap comparing it to other handhelds on the market, $400 is $400, and you would be kicking yourself if you took it apart and managed to break something in the whole process because you'd have to pay for any of those repairs. So if Valve is continuing to be as consumer friendly as they have been with the Steam Deck, I think it's a no-brainer to just eliminate that 64GB model, start with 256, make the middle model 512, and make the Ultimate Edition 1TB, but then shift the pricing so that the cheapest model is still $400. Because, as I mentioned, 2230 drives have gotten so much cheaper over the past year. Like I paid north of $250 for a 1TB one when the Steam Deck launched, which was used, and I just bought a 1TB one on Amazon for $100 for my ROG Ally. So if they're that cheap, I think Valve can kind of afford to include them in the Steam Deck. This one is a must-have for me, and it's a second USB-C port. I think the perfect world situation here is that they leave the one that you use right now on the top exactly where it is, and then they add a second one on the bottom. I know there's like a 50-50 split between gamers on this point, but like I enjoy the fact that the Switch and the Switch OLED and the Switch Lite all have the USB-C port on the bottom of the Switch because I keep a power strip underneath me when I'm sitting on the couch playing. So when I need to plug in, I can just put the cord in the bottom and then it doesn't like get wrapped around my finger or anything like that like it does with the ROG Ally, and it puts a lot less tension on the cable if you're holding the Switch up. It would also open up the Steam Deck to a lot more accessories like cheaper USB-C hubs that don't have power delivery or don't deliver enough power to charge the Steam Deck while you're using that hub. And it would give you peace of mind when you're doing things like reflashing SteamOS or installing Windows or something like that, because you can just sit there knowing your Steam Deck's not gonna die because you can put that flash drive right in the top and then you can put the charger in the bottom. Or you can put the flash drive in the bottom and the cord in the top if you want to be objectively wrong. And I don't care if it's one of those ports or both. I think preferably one just so it keeps the cost of the device down, but regardless, it needs to be Thunderbolt 4 so that the Steam Deck can take advantage of eGPUs. Back when the Nintendo Switch launched in 2016, people looked at that dock and said it would be so cool if down the line Nintendo released a version of the dock that had an external GPU that gave the Switch more power when you docked it and put it in TV mode. Now, because the Switch doesn't use Thunderbolt, there's really no way for that to work, so people kind of set their eyes on the Switch Pro or Switch 2 to do that, but there is a device that can do it right now that I've been messing around with, which is the ROG Ally. ASUS basically has a proprietary eGPU enclosure that has its own sort of port. So ASUS has created this thing called the XG Mobile. There are 3 of them. I think it's like a 6850 XT, there's a 3081 and a 4091. I have the 4091 because I wanted to go overkill with it, and it is absolutely phenomenal. And it doubles as not only an eGPU, but a dock for the ROG Ally as well. It gives you extra USB ports, HDMI ports, and the coolest thing about it is the power supply is built in to the eGPU, so you don't need to carry around this 300 watt power supply or anything like that. It's just like a normal PC power cable that plugs into the back of it. And that's one of the main things that, despite that love-hate relationship, I think makes the ROG Ally a really compelling purchase over the Steam Deck. Being able to take this powerful handheld on the go, get 60 FPS in something like Diablo 4 at 720p, but then take it home and dock it to a 6850 XT or a 4090 mobile card and get up to 4K graphics at high settings, especially with DLSS 3.0 and frame generation, you are looking at the all-in-one can do everything PC situation. But the one double-sided coin of the XG Mobile is that it uses that proprietary cable, which is essentially like PCIe, if I understand it correctly, so you get a direct connection, so there's no performance fall off when you're using that external GPU versus using a built-in laptop GPU. The downside is the connector cord is short, it's proprietary, and yeah, it would just be more convenient if you could use Thunderbolt 4 because that's just like a USB-C cable. And yeah, you lose a little bit of performance, but like losing a little bit of performance on a mobile 4090 isn't going to be the end of the world. And the Steam Deck is built to be the entry-level device for this ecosystem, so you'll have that max power option right there, the ROG Ally and the XG Mobile, and then you'll have the Steam Deck as the entry-level option, which is the Steam Deck and any eGPU you want to throw at it. So yeah, the guaranteed upgrade I want to see is the extra USB-C port, and the one that I don't think we'll see, but I think would be awesome, is Thunderbolt 4 in one of those ports. And the last huge improvement I'd love to see in a Steam Deck 2 is allowing it to run at a higher TDP. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately is that interview Valve did with The Verge last year, where they said when they iterate on the Steam Deck, they're going to use the same chip inside of it because they really like that RDNA 2 chip that they've optimized to run really well at 15 watts. I'm personally fine with that whole idea to keep the Steam Deck's APU unified across the board, but if they're improving the screen, they're improving the USB-C ports, they're improving the storage, why stop there? Why not also improve the cooling? Right now we know that the Steam Deck is the 15 watt champ and the ROG Ally is the turbo mode 25 or 30 watt champ over on that side of the fence. So I was sitting there thinking the other night, why doesn't the Steam Deck have a mode where it could run at a higher TDP like the Ally's turbo mode? And it turns out it's because the cooling in the Steam Deck is just specifically designed for 15 watts, and if you improve the TDP, like made it run at 25 watts, you would just see diminishing returns and it would throttle itself. Also, if it's running at a higher TDP than it's built to sustain, that's when you're going to start seeing things like the SD card slot frying the SD card like you see on the ROG Ally. So going into the Steam Deck 2, despite the fact that Valve wants to keep using the same chip, I think we could get the best of both worlds if they improved the cooling and allowed the same chip to run at a higher TDP, because that seems to be the only barrier between the Steam Deck running games like Diablo 4 at 40 FPS versus 60 FPS, which is what you get on the ROG Ally at the same settings. Of course, that would reduce the battery life, but Valve is so cool about giving you the option of what TDP you want to run at anyway. I don't see why they wouldn't be cool giving us the option to kill the battery life on the Steam Deck too. And yeah, if they're improving everything else, they could definitely afford to put a bigger battery in there as well, and because things get cheaper over time, it probably wouldn't increase the price of the base model. And at that point, if you take everything I just talked about and mix it all together, I think you really do get the perfect Steam Deck 2. You can take it on the go, have enough power to kill your battery life in an hour, but get 60 FPS in a lot of games, or you can drop the TDP down to 15 watts where we know it already works incredibly well. Then you can bring it home and dock it, and the Steam Deck becomes the CPU and the RAM, whereas the eGPU handles all the graphics, and you can run games at a higher resolution like 1440p or 4K. And yeah, at that point, it's basically the perfect PC because it's a 50-50 split between a handheld and a dockable desktop. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you today here on Deck Ready. Make sure you let me know what you think down in the comments below, and remember to subscribe and set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and shape on.